Well, good afternoon, Shawn. How are you doing today?
Hey, Tyler, doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Things are going well here in San Antonio. Amarillo still sunny?
Yeah, man, we're in the 70s today, so I may take off and go to the lake after this.
As you can see, we are joined by a third again today. This time it is one of the other evangelists for the Pepper Road Church of Christ there in Alabama. We are joined today by Stephen Russell. Stephen, thanks for joining us today. You work alongside Marshall McDaniel there at Pepper Road, am I correct?
Yes, Marshall. I've been here about 11 years, and Marshall came to join us about 4 years ago.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, Stephen, we appreciate you being on the show today. We're going to talk a little bit about the Reeves Ellis debate overall and then get into one kind of specific issue that came up. But you kind of have a unique perspective on this debate. You are a member of the church that hosted this debate. But then you also have a personal relationship with Joel going back decades. Would you just like to talk, give a little bit of background about yourself, and then kind of what brought about this debate?
Yeah. So Joel and I, yeah, we go back all the way. He mentioned in his interview with you guys that our fathers were friends in high school, and my dad, I think, was the best man at his wedding, and vice versa. And so we grew up in the same area in Birmingham, Alabama. And so our family spent a good bit of time around each other. So we've known each other our whole lives, essentially. And also, as you mentioned, we began preaching about the same time. We had a lot of interaction in the Birmingham area as we were near each other in our works. He mentioned that I was probably a better Hebrew student, that it was demonstrably not true. Joel was always more of a reader and studier than I was. And, he had a good work ethic. But anyway, over the years, we stayed in contact pretty well. And then, as he mentioned, he started making shifts, and those shifts were somewhat public to begin with on social media and so forth. And we had some back and forth along those lines, and drifted, of course, as his beliefs drifted. Then I had limited contact with him over the years. But when Bruce was here holding a meeting, we were just talking about Calvinism and talking about some of his debates with Calvinism. And I mentioned Joel, and I said, some of the questions I'd asked Joel over the years and so forth. And Bruce, his eyebrows raised. Said, "Do you think this guy would be interested in a debate?" I said, "I don't know. Here's his contact info. You give him a call." So that's how that came to be.
All right. Um, Let me ask you, Stephen. Shawn and I posed this question to Marshall. We want to pose it to you as well. There's not a lot of debates that happen today. I think you talk to anybody that attended this debate, they're going to say that the disputants were respectful towards each other, kind towards each other, brotherly towards each other, that uh, the political debates that we see, this debate is nothing like that. But talk to us about how was this debate received there at the local church among whom you work there at Pepper Road? How did the congregation respond to it?
Yeah, I think mostly people were very favorable and even excited about it, both leading in and coming away from it. I will say that there's probably a degree of difficulty in the subjects being discussed and the technicalities, maybe the terminology and so forth. There's also, and we'll talk about this today, some degree of confusion about the positions Joel holds. So coming out of the debate, there's a lot of, I don't understand what his position on this is. And I think, particularly on the subject we're talking about today, it is for Calvinism in general. I think it is a difficult concept for people to wrap their heads around. And to be charitable to Calvinists, it is a difficult concept, period. I just think that their solutions are untenable, right? I think their solutions are hold mutually exclusive truths at the same time. So there was some of that. There was some concern along those lines for younger people, that when you're talking in a debate that deals with technical terms, that maybe doesn't have kind of in the hearer's mind a slam dunk finish, like, oh, okay, that, some people might want some more of that. But overall, I think, again, very favorable was the response.
Yeah, if you were showing up to this debate looking for this guy believes baptism is essential, this guy believes baptism is not essential, and we're attacking 1 Peter 3 and Mark 16 and Matthew 28, you were going to be vastly disappointed, because you're right that there was much more of a technical nature that took place. But I think things of a technical nature that laid the framework then for that last two nights of the debate, where you could really sink your teeth in and understand, okay, here's where these two disputants are. Here are the differences in their approaches, and here's why it matters.
Yeah, and the subject matter involves areas where I think both sides agree there are difficulties and mysteries here that will get beyond our ability to explain, and that's part of the problem, right? I don't think that means the whole subject matter is in that area, but certainly areas of it, and there is a little bit of each side pressing on the other in areas where, I mean, frankly, neither side's going to be able to give a satisfactory explanation, and so that's just the nature of the subject that was being debated.
So, Stephen, as you kind of sit in your position now, and you got to be there moderating all four nights of the debate, and then I'm sure you've taken time to go back and listen to the debate where you're not an active participant in it. What if you want to talk for a couple of minutes here? That's fine. What do you walk away from this debate with in terms of impressions, in terms of satisfaction with what happened, questions that still may linger? What's your overall response to observing the debate as just a spectator?
Stephen, as you do that, for those who may not have seen the debate yet, aren't familiar with debating, can you kind of explain your role as the moderator and how that worked into the whole debate?
Yeah. Moderator is someone who basically listens for any rule violations, any out of order aspects. There really wasn't any of that. I will say, in any debate, just looking at the rules, it's sort of like calling football. You could call holding on every play. I'm sure technically there were some things that could have been called, but it was well within the bounds of charitable reading of the rules. And I don't think anybody certainly intentionally violated, or even in any egregious way went outside the boundary. So my role was sitting there and listening for the most part, and of course talking with Bruce. We during the debate, both during the speeches, but then obviously in between, as we all gathered together, we would evaluate and think of responses and so forth. As far as evaluating the debate, I'll say, first of all, that having been to several debates, it did rise above the typical, both in rancor and in actually trying to deal with the propositions at hand. One of the most frustrating things, obviously, is the personal attacks that you see in political debates and so forth, that avoid the subject altogether and just looking for one-liners. But even in religious debates where you don't see as much of that, you still see a lot of talking past and avoiding the subject at hand, and nobody's answering the other person's questions, and that can be pretty frustrating. There is a degree of that, even in this debate, that there's always going to be, because there's pre-prepared statements and things you plan to say, and you can't respond to every single thing the other person says. And so you might be sitting there going, oh, I hope he responds to this. But Bruce or Joel thinks that this other thing is more important to respond to and then they don't have time to respond to the thing that you wish they'd respond to. So that's going to happen. It's going to feel that way a little bit. And to that end, I'll be honest, just in debates in general, while I definitely think they're profitable, and this one particularly I thought was, at some level, what I hope these kind of debates spur is actual conversations where there can be a back and forth, where we don't have a whole speech that lays out several ideas and then one or two of those get responded to, but just line by line, idea by idea, we kind of work back and forth in discussing with people, because when you're having a conversation, and there may be some people you talk to, but you don't give a 20-minute speech and then wait while the other person talks. That's usually not how that works. And so I think there's just some, I think,
Whoops.
I think there's some dynamics there that just that just are going to limit how far you can go and how much you can accomplish. Sure. That's just the nature of the venue.
Was there a passage? I think we talked with this about Marshall. We asked Joel this. We asked Bruce this. We'll pose it to you as well. Is there a passage of Scripture, or is there a topic that you were expecting to arise in this debate that for one reason or another either didn't materialize or materialized, but just in a very brief fashion, and like you described, because of other things that were going on, it just didn't get the time and attention that you were hoping for? Is there something that stood out in your mind like that?
I thought Joel would press the sovereignty passages more. He brought them up early, but I thought he didn't lean on them nearly as much as I would have thought. There are places, obviously, where it talks about God directing, God guiding, even the hearts of men, the decisions of kings. And he brought some of those up. But I thought in those passages in Job, I thought there were verses in Job that he didn't bring up that I thought, well, that would probably make your point even harder. That are difficult. And I don't mean impossible for us to deal with, but they are difficult. And so I thought he would lean more on that. As far as on the other end, all through, and anytime you're a preacher and you're listening to somebody else do the thing that you do, you're bound to sit there and go, well, I think you should say this. I think you should use this passage. I don't want to go too far down that road. I think Bruce did a good job, and obviously he had 4 or 5 or 6 of us screaming in his ear the whole time, and so he had to figure out which one of those things he wanted to say. So I might have done some strategically different things, but that's not to criticize what Bruce did. I thought he did well.
No, yeah. All right. So, Shawn, you want to add anything in before we transition to something else?
Well, yeah, I'll just agree with what Stephen said there. I think I did think it was interesting some of the places Joel didn't go. I think I've already mentioned this. I really thought he'd go to Romans 9 more and really work Romans 9. He mentioned it. I was pretty shocked, because typically I think that's a passage that people with Joel's position think really helps them and creates some difficulty for us. So I was a little shocked by that. But overall, I thought both men at least tried to defend their proposition, which is not always the case.
I was really shocked that Joel took this sort of national identity position on Romans 9, which definitely changes his usage of that. Now, I think, I'm not sure, but I think he would still say Paul applies it in an individual way, but that it's coming from national identity, which obviously the original text is. So I'm not sure how much that changes, but also maybe he listened to what Bruce had already done on that and felt like Bruce's response would be effective enough that wouldn't be his wheelhouse, or it wouldn't be as strong as maybe it would for somebody who's not ready to respond to that.
You
Sure.
say that, and Shawn, I wonder if you would agree with me on this. out of the many debates that we have been a part of, that we've been a party to, that we've listened to, that Bruce has been involved in, Joel seems to be the disputant that had done the most background work on Bruce's positions, where he's coming from, and what he had dealt with in previous discussions. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. I know in previous debates, I think even Stephen Garrett might have even mentioned that Bruce was a little different than the last guy he debated, or something along those lines. So yeah, I do think Joel had done some homework and done some preparation. And I do wonder if you're right, Stephen, if that's not why he did not spend more time in Romans chapter 9. And his position seems a little different from most of the Calvinists I've read too. So maybe he felt more comfortable not getting into that, having explained the nuances of his position there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll say, with Joel in general, he's always been studious and very thorough, a prodigious reader. I remember when he was in a gospel meeting where I was preaching, and I was watching a football game, Auburn game, and he is reading a book while we're watching. And I'm not even capable of doing that, much less would I think of doing that. So anyway, he's always been very thorough in trying to be prepared, and I think he's probably a more well-read Calvinist than you would generally run into reading into older documents and more traditional. But I'll say for Bruce, he's more well-read than what a typical Calvinist would run into.
Yeah,
that just struck me. We all have, I'm sure, seen debates where the disputants come in, and as you were saying, Stephen, they kind of have their canned speeches already ready to go, and they are responding to what they view the other person's position as being, not what the other person has articulated. And I thought we avoided that for the most part in this debate, that it was very much, hey, they had corresponded for 2 years previously. So here they are. They have talked together. They have figured out, hey, here's what I believe. Okay, here's what I believe. And there was engagement on that baseline. The engagement was not, oh, well, I've read what members of the Church of Christ have written. I've read what members of in Presbyterian circles have written, and here's where you guys are wrong on that.
Yeah, I think there was not. Well, I'll say this: there was not much of the. Whoa! I didn't imagine he would have believed that. Right? I don't think that on either side. There was some, but I mean, obviously, I think we would all agree there were a couple of things about election that we were kind of surprised in Joel's position. Had not heard before, but. What I think was, and maybe this is because there was all of that understanding beforehand, there was an acknowledgement of the difference between what was thought and what was said, right? We understood Joel was saying something different than what we thought he would say. One of the things I think so frustrating about debates is people kind of, a lot of times, press ahead with their preconceived notion of what the other person believes, even after the other person says that's not actually what I believe.
Right.
So we had to kind of adjust. Bruce had to kind of adjust on the fly of, okay, that's not the position I thought he took on this. Now, not overall, but in some particulars.
Sure.
And I think Joel did that as well, making those adjustments. And so that's some honesty on both sides of, okay, you don't believe precisely what I thought you believed, and so let me adjust my arguments accordingly. Whereas in a lot of debates, it's I'm going to argue the person I came here to argue against, regardless of who you actually are.
Yeah. I was glad we avoided that, and I think that's a good thing to point out there. All right. So if you have not been on our channel before, if you've not been a part of these discussions before, as we mentioned, we are reviewing the Reeves-Ellis discussion that took place back in November 2025 at the church building of the Pepper Road Church of Christ. On the first two nights, the proposition was this: the scriptures teach that those who obey the gospel of their own free will and only those become the elect of God. Affirming that proposition was Bruce Reeves, and denying that proposition was Joel Ellis. On Thursday and Friday nights of that week, the proposition kind of shifted into the opposite. The scriptures teach that God chose from the foundation of the world a definite number of people to be saved, not on the basis of anything foreseen in them, but solely on the basis of his own purpose and grace. Joel Ellis affirmed that, and Bruce Reeves denied that. And what we're wanting to talk about today, Stephen, you made a statement earlier about speakers wanting to respond to something but running out of time. That you've got so much material, it's sometimes hard to respond to something that the other side throws at you. We want to talk about an issue, Stephen, that was raised on night one, but that we really don't get any treatment of in a significant way until we get to night four. It was on night one that Mr. Reeves introduced a quotation from a man named Mark Talbot. And while that's a name that many of us might not be familiar with, some of us are going to be familiar with the name John Piper. And Mark Talbot's quote is featured on the Desiring God website that is part of John Piper's ministry. I'm going to read this quote to us, and I think Shawn's going to put it up on the screen for those who are following along with us. In his quote, Mr. Talbot says this, quote, "Nothing that exists or occurs falls outside God's ordaining will. Nothing, including no evil person or thing or event or deed. God's foreordination is the ultimate reason why everything comes about, including the existence of all evil persons and things and the occurrence of any evil acts or events. And so it is not inappropriate to take God to be the creator, the sender, the permitter, and sometimes even the instigator of evil. Nothing, no evil thing or person or event or deed falls outside God's ordaining will. Nothing arises, exists, or endures independently of God's will. So when even the worst of evils befall us, they do not ultimately come from anywhere other than God's hand." Now, Mr. Reeves put that quote up and kind of pressed Mr. Ellis on it. Shawn, very briefly, why did Mr. Reeves even bring up this idea of evil in the context of a debate that focuses on the elect of God? Why are we even talking about evil?
Well, we spent a lot of time in the debate, both debaters talking about sovereignty and their view of sovereignty. And Mr. Ellis, I think, made it pretty clear that he believed in what we would call meticulous sovereignty, which is the idea that everything that occurs was predetermined by God. And that comes with certain consequences. And I think what Bruce was trying to do here, and I think what he did here, was show that, hey, if that's the case, then every evil thing was predetermined by God. In other words, it only happened because God decided that it happened. And that brings up another, I think, contradictory idea that Calvinists have to deal with, that God's somehow holy and perfect and yet responsible for all moral evil. And I think that's a tremendous challenge to the Calvinistic position. I know the creeds just kind of say that's the way it is, but I'm not sure how that's the way it is. And so I think what Bruce was trying to do throughout the debate was really press to, hey, let's try to reconcile this. How do you reconcile this, Mr. Ellis, in your mind? And how can God be holy and be the ultimate reason for all evil?
Stephen, you mentioned something earlier about debates kind of drawing out and exposing when we might be holding two competing truths. Is that kind of what you're seeing here, being the genesis of this discussion within the context of election?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem of evil is one of the most discussed issues when it comes to God. Theodicy, I think there's probably more books written from an apologetic standpoint on theodicy than maybe any other subject, which is hilarious from the standpoint of when skeptics say nobody addresses this question. I'm like, literally everybody addresses this question. It may not be satisfactory in the answer, but everybody talks about it. Because it is difficult, and it is a glaring issue, right? You have a good God and you have a wicked world, and how do we reconcile those two things? And the Calvinist, I think, gives too much weight to the statements that say God controls all. And then carries that on to even making him responsible for the wickedness that is in the world, if not by explicit statement, certainly by definite implication. They're the open theists, who, especially radical open theists, who go the other direction and almost make God impotent to make any sort of defense against the will of man. And so it is a difficult place where we're trying to balance two truths that make a reality out of man's will. It's interesting, as you read that first proposition that only those saved by their free will, and only those by their free will, right? I wonder, like, depending on the definition, if Joel might actually agree if we define free will, because right, because that was one of the issues in all of this.
It was a source of tension in the discussion. It was.
Right, is what is man's free will? So in the sense that Joel defines that, wouldn't it be that only those are saved who by their free will choose to be saved? Then that free will, of course, would be traced back to God eventually. But that he would allow for that language depending on how you define free will. But that's the part of this that's so frustrating is that conversation of what does that mean? What do you mean by that term free will?
Shawn, this is something you and I have seen Bruce do, I think, in every debate that we've ever been a part of or we've been a party to. Speech one, night one, immediately after Mr. Reeves will read his proposition, what is the next thing that he does, Shawn?
He'll define the terms right down to the 66 books of the Bible. Oftentimes, he'll make sure.
Discussion. By scriptures, we mean the 66 books of your Bible, Old and New Testaments, right? It's one of his calling cards now, right? So yeah.
And I think, by the way, that was exceptionally important in this debate because one of the first terms he defined was free will as he was using it. And then, and Joel, to his credit, I think, I don't know if he did it right off the bat, but he did explain that he was arguing for compatibilism and gave us some idea of what his concept of free will was.
I think this is something that led, I think there was a general feeling of frustration, not at the disputants, but just coming out of Monday night, because Monday night was not what so many people were expecting. And I think this reason right here is it. There was terminology that was being used by both disputants that seemed to be the exact same words, but were being used in completely different manners. Was that your feeling on it, Stephen?
Yeah. The terminology was a big hurdle on the first night, and especially Joel says repeatedly that we agree, and I think I want to be charitable I don't think that's completely disingenuous, but I do think what it is an effort to lean on ambiguity of definitions that's not productive. So when somebody says, when we're using the same word in two different ways, and we say the same statement, but we mean different things by the words within that statement, then it can sound like we agree, but we don't really. If we don't agree on what those words mean. So if I say man has free will and Joel says man has free will, we don't mean the same thing. We just said the same, like we literally said the same words, but we don't mean the same thing, which means we don't agree. Now, I think, and to be completely fair, I think Joel thinks that if he presses on our definitions, we would have to admit that they don't hold up, and that we would, like, somewhere deep down, actually agree with his position. I don't think that. I mean, I think I can press on my definitions and they'll hold up. But I think that may be where he's coming from, is if I press hard enough, it'll expose that you actually agree with what I'm saying. This is, I think, a tactic of Calvinists in general, right? So you say something about man's free will, so God's not in control of everything, right? And what are we going to say? Okay, but he is in control, and so then there ends up being this kind of capitulation, and I think they lean on that because you're not able to precisely define the boundaries and so forth of God's control, and they are able to definitively say all of it, right? He's in control of all of it. And because we have a little bit more less defined position, then they think they're going to lean on that and show the cracks.
So, Stephen, I think it's very prescient that you said that. What you said earlier, sometimes something gets introduced that it takes a speaker a while to get around to. And I think this is something we all had in the backs of our minds that we were kind of worried about. Mr. Reeves brings up that Mark Talbot quote on night one. Joel doesn't pick it up on night one. Mr. Ellis doesn't pick it up on night two. Mr. Ellis doesn't pick it up on night three. And so we're like, okay, is this going to get dealt with? Because Mr. Reeves has brought it up every night. And to his credit, Mr. Ellis does not wait until last speech last night. I mean, give the guy all the credit in the world. You deal with it, and then you let your opponent say something back to it. I give him all the credit in the world for that. But Stephen, what you just said seems to be just exactly how this question played out. I'm gonna read it. It's gonna take just a second. I want to read Mr. Ellis's response to the Mark Talbot quote that Mr. Reeves brought up every night. This is in Joel's first affirmative on night 4 of the discussion. So Friday night, affirmative number 1, and I'm going to quote exactly what Joel said, beginning here. Joel says, quote, Bruce seems to think that my view of God's foreordination of all things means that God assigns sinful motives and actions to specific individuals. And I've tried in multiple speeches to explain that that is not the case. Maybe he does believe that's a necessary implication, and I'm just not recognizing my own position. We'll come back to that in a second. Continuing on. Every desire given by God to man is good. God did not make man sinful. Man makes himself sinful. We pervert our good, God-given desires in order to pursue and practice evil. And God's foreordination does not make anyone wicked or make anyone do anything wicked. The Lord is not tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone to sin. But he does ordain whatsoever comes to pass. He governs all things, as we saw in the Psalms several times this week. He does whatever he pleases in heaven and on earth. Bruce asked multiple times that I respond to a quote from Mark Talbot. He's shown you that quote several times, and he might do so again tonight, and indeed he did. The chapter from which that quote is taken is freely available online. You can download the entire book that it's contained in from Desiring God Ministries. It's a book on suffering and the sovereignty of God, and I would commend that work to you. Bruce selected the particular quote that he's shown us for the emotional impact and the revulsion that he knew it would produce, and that's well done in the context of a debate. But if you read the quote in its context, you might have a different reaction to it. And I will say, since Bruce has asked me to respond to it, that I do affirm what Talbot says there and in the chapter as a whole. He presents an extensive biblical case for it. And Stephen, to your point now, and I would ask, should we instead believe that God was unable or unwilling to stop the Nazis' brutality and the evil of the serial killer who is named in that quote? Should we conclude that God's commitment to their free will was more important than preventing the harm that their free will decisions would cause? God does not make anyone evil. He does not place evil desires in their hearts. He does not cause them to sin. So Bruce can take for granted that that's what I believe, even if he thinks, again, the necessary implication may be otherwise. End quote. So, Stephen, what you said, free will question is not resolved to the satisfaction of Mr. Ellis. So are we then to believe other extreme? Right? That's kind of how this played out. I want us, if you guys don't mind, I want us to kind of walk through this exchange here, because I think this was telling in the context of the debate. The first thing that Joel said there, I've tried in multiple speeches to explain that I don't believe that God is the first cause for evil, that God assigns sinful motives and actions to specific individuals. Joel says, maybe Bruce does believe that's a necessary implication, and I'm just not recognizing my own position. We heard this viewpoint presented in the debate of meticulous sovereignty, and we've talked about that a little bit here, and in previous episodes we've dealt with that as well, meticulous sovereignty. The idea that God rules over every decision and in fact seems to be the ordaining cause behind any decision, any action, any thought. Stephen, is there some tension here? Maybe Bruce does believe that's a necessary implication, and I'm just not recognizing my own position. Well, is there some tension that Joel is feeling here? Is there some tension brought about by Calvinism generally as it tries to deal with the question of evil? What's going on here in this first quote?
So, yes, there's tension, and I think but I think Calvinists admit that there's tension. They're okay with that, and that's kind of their point. I mean, if you read what Calvinists have to say, or what compatibilism says, it's that you have to be okay with the tension. That essentially what they're saying is the Bible says this, and the Bible says this. They don't harmonize in our minds. But it's not our mind that is in consideration; it's God's mind, and so we leave that to Him. But I think that's the difference between, like, there are things that we would all agree cause some tension that we have to be at rest with, right? That we have to be okay with things that feel like they're, I mean, justice and mercy are at tension with one another, but that tension resolves in Christ, right? But the Bible doesn't just leave us with saying it's all a mystery. The cross is where that tension resolves. And the cross is where we see both justice and mercy, right? That the sins, that mercy does not triumph over justice by the disappearance of justice. It does it by the absorbing of justice, and so there isn't there isn't an unresolved tension, even though we still feel it, right? We still feel that pull of justice and mercy. So I think that's something of what's going on here. Is they're just saying, look, it's just tension. It's two realities, and they're pulling against each other. But there's a resolution, even though we can't see or explain that resolution. And I think that's the difference. Is here there's no explanation that can satisfy with that position. That you're holding, mutually exclusive statements, and that one can't be true and the other be true. When it tells us that God is not a liar, the expectation is that we can evaluate, that we can know, because we can evaluate the truth of God's statements. And so if God is saying two mutually exclusive things, then the expectation, and I think this is the way, like, we look at the Psalms, the way the New Testament looks at the Psalms, the New Testament, it shows and it exposes that Psalm can't be talking about David. Because David's flesh did see corruption, right? And so you could imagine somebody going, well, there's a sense in which David, no. His flesh saw corruption. And so you can't fully apply that psalm to David. And then therefore the New Testament writer says, but you can apply it to Jesus, right? So it's satisfied in Jesus in reality, in truth, not just in some metaphorical way, in some real way. It applies to Jesus in a way that it could not have applied to David. And so the Bible expects us to use that sort of logic where a thing can't be true, and then it demands that we look for the reconciliation. And I think what the Calvinist says is you don't have to. You can chalk it up to mystery and say, we can't understand it, it's beyond us. And Deuteronomy 29:29 allows us to just accept
the hidden things belong to the Lord.
Right, that we can accept mutually exclusive realities.
Shawn, as Stephen gives his response there, what's standing out in your mind?
Well, that has been my struggle in understanding the Calvinist position. Listening to Joel's speeches, talking to Joel in our interview, we kept coming back to this very idea. I don't understand how both these statements can be true at the same time. I don't know how God can foreordain, not just foreknow, foreordain whatsoever comes to pass, and yet have no moral culpability whatsoever for the evil that comes to pass. I don't know how we can say that all of human history is just playing out what God has pre-written in essence, and then somehow exclude evil from that.
Let me throw something out there in some kind of a steel manning of the argument here. I think that a Calvinist would say that God uses evil like a tool, right? That it's there. So out of context, the work that a doctor does, described out of context, is evil. He puts people through pain and anguish and suffering. He cuts people open. He sticks them with needles. Right? You could describe what a doctor does in a way that makes him sound like a monster, even as he is bringing tremendous healing to someone. And I think that the Calvinist position would be that God is using all of that. And for us, we only see the thing that he's using, and we see it as evil. So an example is when Habakkuk, cries out to God about the using of the Chaldeans. This is awful. But what God is doing with the Chaldeans is just and good and right. But if you're only seeing it from the standpoint of a bystander, then you're looking and you're saying this is evil, this is wicked, and God says no, this is good and this is just. So we would agree that there are times where evil is being conducted and God is using it for good purposes, and God is not responsible for the wickedness. He is responsible for the using of that wickedness for his good purposes. Now, I would say two things. First of all, that the Calvinist goes farther than that. They don't say God uses the evil for his good purposes, but he ordains. And secondly, they universalize it so that every single evil done is done ultimately by God, that he is the ultimate cause of that evil. And I say that he's the cause. He's the explanatory cause, but he is not morally responsible for that causing. He is not morally responsible for the evil that's done. So, so on the one hand, I see what they're doing, and I think that there are ways in which a piece of what they're saying is true. I think it's carried too far, which is what I think about a lot of Calvinism, right? I think there are true things being said that are carried too far. And I think this is one of those things.
Something else I would point out, though, like your doctor illustration, we don't put the doctor in prison for what appeared to be evil that actually was not evil. God says this thing that is evil, I'm going to throw you into hell for. And so there's a major distinction, and I think you're probably right in the way you're illustrating this, but this is the problem with the way of thinking. Number two, and I think just as importantly, it's God who says it's evil. Right? We don't come from our perspective and look and go, oh, well, this is evil or that is evil, and then that has eternal consequences. God says this is evil, by the way, because it's contrary to God's nature. And this is what's righteous. And these are the things that will, separate you from me. And so, I get the idea of perspective, a perspective causing a problem. But I think that kind of falls apart when you start to ask, okay, well, who said lying is evil? Well, it wasn't you and I, right? And the Chaldeans, let's think about Habakkuk for just a second. What was necessary for God to bring about his purpose with Nebuchadnezzar? It wasn't the overt evil. It was Nebuchadnezzar coming in and taking the Jews away into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar's the one who chose to do that in a highly oppressive way and commit all kind of atrocities along the way, none of which were necessary. And God tells Habakkuk, oh, I'll punish him for that. All he had to do was come down there and put a siege up around Jerusalem until those doors opened and take those people to Babylon. And so, to me, every time you kind of press these things a little bit, the Calvinistic position, the cracks begin to show. What they're saying makes a lot of sense if we identified evil and not God. These things make a lot of sense if there was, well, I don't know how to make sense out of them. I'll just be honest with you right there. But at the end of the day, I've only done what God predetermined I would do. Which makes me wonder, where does this idea of evil even come from?
Yeah.
Right? If I take the Calvinistic position, what makes a thing evil? If all I've ever done, and this is where I kept trying to press Joel a little bit in our interview, if my evil desire, like where do my evil desires come from? If I'm just acting according to my desires, where do my evil desires come from? I don't know where else to land that other than the mind of God. He determined that I would have those desires. And I think that's why Bruce kept bringing this quote up again and again and again. He wasn't saying that Joel believed every word in the quote. He was asking Joel to deal with that, I'll use Joel's phrase, logical incoherency that is involved in claiming God determines everything that comes to pass, and yet is somehow free from any moral responsibility for that.
Yeah. So I think one of the issues in trying to work through this is that and Joel brought this out in one of his quotes that like somehow God's going to do this to preserve man's free will. Well, yeah, and so the question is that a sufficient reason? So the reality is, this is true. God could stop all evil and does not. Like, this is a true premise. We agree with that. The distinction here, right, is on their explanation for that. Why God does not stop is because he's going to use it. He is using it, right? He is crafting it and using it and bringing about what he wants to bring about. And God's got this massive moral tapestry, and it's all going to make sense, or it does all make sense to him, and we just can't see it. So that's the Calvinist explanation. Mm-hmm. Our explanation is that people are making divergent choices all through, that God can still accomplish what he wants to, even outside of controlling those wills, and that there are times where men do things that are absolutely not according to God's purposes, not according to his direction or his desires, and God is powerful and sovereign and can still accomplish his purposes, while man is granted a degree of sovereignty beneath that sovereignty to make his own choices. So I would put this like the American nation, right? What is the value of freedom, right? How high of a priority do we place on that? What are we willing to suffer and endure as a nation in order to have the freedoms that we enjoy? Now, I think sometimes we overstate the value of that, to be sure. It's not ultimate, that there ought to be restrictions, there ought to be thus far and no farther. But we have all agreed that there are dangers and difficulties, evils that we have all agreed to sort of absorb as a consequence of providing for the most possible freedom. And so I think that comes down as a reflection of the characteristic of God. God has created a world in which a priority, and to use the word, to say a priority is kind of a oxymoron. Priority means singular, right? Priority is to provide man with that room to act according to his own will. And of course, that's a prerequisite for relationship. If there is no free will, there is no relationship. And so these are valid explanations. It's not just coming out of some modernistic notion that freedom is the most important thing. It is to say that without freedom, there can be no real relationship. And throughout history, you find that nations that practice total control will inevitably collapse because it's not real. It can't be true and real. And so God certainly is in a powerful place and has ultimate power. He could. I'm not saying he's not capable of taking away our free will. So he stands in this ultimate place, but he refuses to take away that free will. Does that then make him responsible? You see, this is the difference. Joel would say our position makes God responsible for the evil in the same way that his position, or we make a distinction that's no different than his distinction. But the difference is that's like saying like a gun manufacturer is responsible for every evil committed by the gun he manufactures. It's not true. Now, it's an argument people make, but it's not a true argument. The founding fathers of our nation are not responsible for every evil thing that the people of this nation do with that freedom, right? That they were providing for freedom in order to accomplish good, knowing that people would also use that freedom to accomplish evil. I think God has done much the same thing.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I might take it a step further, like looking at this quote where Joel says, and I would ask, should we instead believe that God was unable or unwilling to stop the Nazis' brutality? I think that's a little bit of a diversion, whether he means for it to be or not. I think it's one that most Calvinists utilize. That's not the question. Everybody knows God could stop whatever God wants to stop. But under this Calvinistic framework, he didn't just not stop it. He predetermined that it would occur. This is why I think if you ever watch a debate between a Calvinist and an atheist, Calvinists have a very difficult time dealing with the atheistic arguments about evil and the existence of God, because evil is sourced in God's will, in God's intent, in God's purpose. The framework you just laid out, that God has allowed free will so that there could be true relationship. If you go back to Genesis 1, it seems that fellowship is the purpose for the creation of man. And so he allows you and I to make a free will, libertarian A or B choice to love him or not. And one of the consequences of that is that some will not. And that's going to lead to evil. And not only that, some of us may generally, but in moments, not act that way. That's just a consequence of liberty, which your illustration there about the Second Amendment and so forth, I think is a good illustration of that. All liberty can be abused, but we still recognize value in the liberty. And especially in this conversation, how else could there be a true loving relationship between God and his creation? And I don't think you could have one.
Yeah, and that is a legitimate degree of separation, right? To say, I allowed you to do something, and then you use that liberty to be wicked is far different than I'm the one who caused you to do the evil. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now you're responsible, right? And that's what we do. Like in criminal cases, there's a difference between somebody. We talk about criminal liability, right? It's someone responsible in that they cooperated. Did they cooperate in bringing this about, or was this brought about in a way that flows from legitimate liberty that was given, right? So I sell you a gun and you shoot somebody, then I'm not criminally liable for what you do with the thing that I sold you. I didn't sell you that in a way that was participating. Now, if you come to my house as a friend and say, I'd like to borrow a gun to go kill somebody, now I'm a participant. Or even if I'm the one who says, hey, I'm going to leave this gun for you. I heard you were angry with so-and-so. Right? There's other ways I might manipulate and participate. But there's legitimate degrees of separation, even though we might say, yeah, well, if you hadn't have done this, this wouldn't have happened. That still doesn't make you liable. It still doesn't make you responsible for what the other person did. So I think we've got a legitimate degree of separation where I think Joel does not have a legitimate degree of separation, where he has God being the ultimate cause, and what we have is God causing the liberty, but not the thing that we do with the liberty.
So let me follow up on that then. As I continue through Joel's quote, God did not make man sinful, man makes himself sinful. And then just after that, God's foreordination does not make anyone do anything wicked. Stephen, help me understand. I was raised in Arkansas. I have an Arkansas education. I'm trying to process this. My Arkansas education almost is saying this sounds like double talk, and I know Joe's not trying to do that. So what is he trying to communicate? Because I'm hearing on the one hand meticulous sovereignty and compatibilistic free will, not libertarian free will. But then I'm hearing God did not make man sinful, man makes himself sinful. But God's foreordination does not make anyone do anything wicked. I know this is some more of that tension, but what is he trying to say here?
So when let's say you've got a
be the Calvinist, Stephen. Give me an answer.
Yeah. Let's say you've got a dog. Well, Joel, let's use a lion. Just
don't use pickles.
You got a lion who wants to eat meat. And what you do is throw meat into the cage with the lion. You don't make the lion eat the meat. All right. But if you're the one that threw the meat in there, then you're responsible for the lion eating the meat. Right. That's not,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yep.
and I think the difference is that, and Joel used the illustration of the lion. I think this is a critical difference that Joel is removing by implication. Not he doesn't explicitly state this, but Joel is removing by implication man's moral capability and reducing it down to mere inherited instinct. And that's his ultimate point. We will do according to what we want to do, right? We'll act according to our greatest desire. I think that was the way that he put it.
Mm-hmm.
And we will
Yes.
act according to our greatest desire. Now, there's a sense in which, again, this gets into philosophical territory. You know, when Jesus says, "Not my will, but thy will," I see a competing wills and him surrendering his desire to another desire, right? And we see that pattern throughout Scripture. But then Joel would come back and say, yes, but his greatest desire was to do God's will. Okay. All right. So you're kind of in that circular logic realm there. My point would be that man does have real competing desires in his mind. And in the same day can choose to prioritize one of those desires and then choose to prioritize the other one. That we are not static in our greatest desires, that they change and that they are changeable by us. And so I think this is where Joel's equating us to the animal is a little bit Darwinistic. And I think that's one of the ironies of Calvinism is that it lines up very well with Darwinian determinism, right? That we only do what we've inherited from our forefathers. You know, we're all hunter-gatherers, we're all lizard brains and all of these things. Just supply Adam instead, right? We're sinful by nature. We can't do anything else. And that we don't have real moral complexity. That either our sinful nature is controlling our mind or our regenerated nature is controlling our mind. But that there isn't that moral complexity that says some days I decide this and other days I decide that. And I think that's where the difference between real freedom and this sort of a freedom to do what you want, freedom to follow your greatest desire. That second aspect, freedom to follow your greatest desire, assumes your greatest desire is really manufactured outside of self.
So, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong here. I'm seeing, I'm hearing, I'm sensing a connection between everything you just talked about there and kind of the beginning place of Calvinistic theology, which says you are totally depraved and you cannot make a choice for good apart from the regenerating work of God accomplished through the Holy Spirit. Am I right to see some sort of connection
Okay,
there?
look, yeah. So now you're getting into. I think this goes back to Augustine. I think Augustine is a Gnostic, and I think he's somebody who ports the pagan ideologies into Christianity. He has.
Well, Stephen, tell us how you really feel.
Yeah, I think. I think a lot worse things. No, I think that he hated the flesh, right? I think he had a low view of human flesh that comes out of paganism and not out of Christianity, not out of the Bible. And so he's an ascetic. He is someone who sees, sexual activity even within marriage as a necessary evil. And so I think Augustine lays the foundations for this corrupted flesh viewpoint. I think the Catholic Church picks it up for political purposes because it allows them to control the one aspect of life that they weren't already controlling, which is birth. Right. So now coming in, they need to baptize you at birth. You've got Pelagians or Pelagius, who's arguing from the other standpoint, which is, I think, the standard interpretation for most normal thinking people, which is that we are that good and evil is left in our hands, and that we can grasp for good and we can grasp for evil. And so I think Augustine tilts that balance, and he does so, and he taints interpretation. And he's still regarded, obviously, as one of the greatest theologians of all time. I think he's been one of the most destructive theologians of all time. And so I do think the foundational elements are: we are wicked and terrible creatures down to the core, and can choose to be no other.
So, and so that leads to a question: then why? And is in the Calvinistic viewpoint, if we are these wicked, terrible creatures, why? And is the answer going to be because Adam sinned and now that's tainted us? Is that the answer?
Yeah. I'd say you obviously have different explanations, but
Sure.
the one that
Which one fits most the context of this discussion?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't ferreted that out with Joel. Obviously, some people take the position, yes. And I think Joel, I did have a conversation with him one time, and he said, if anybody ever had libertarian free will, Adam would have been the closest to that, right? So he certainly would believe that Adam's will and choice was distinct and different from our will and choice. And that Adam had something that looked more like libertarian. I don't know what fine distinctions he might make there. So, yes, when Adam made the decision, he federally made the decision for us all, right? That we all follow after that path. And that we all become, right, as a father, we sin through Adam, right, because we are of the household of Adam, because he's our federal head, then we are all sinners under that. But more than that, we inherit that nature that comes down through that. So yeah, I think the cleanest explanation would be there was a time where we did have choice, but that time ended pretty quickly. And ever since then, nobody's had true libertarian free will. That we've all been, sinners down to the core.
Yeah. Problem there is the belief that whatsoever comes to pass, right?
Right. Which I think
you just,
I think that's the point to press, right? If I were debating a Calvinist, that's where you got to go back to, because it's the thing we can agree on. At least at some level, right? We agree that Adam and Eve I think we are like Adam and Eve, right? That we all eat of the fruit, we all have our own choice, we all make the wrong choice. But we and they would agree that Adam and Eve had a degree of true libertarian free will. So when they chose sin, who ordained that? I believe God ordained the freedom that allowed them to choose that, but did not ordain them to choose that. And when somebody says, so you're saying it was possible for man not to eat of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, I am saying that. I do think that's possible. And then somebody says, well, then how could God, before the foundations of the world? Now I really think you are getting into mysteries, right? I don't know what that looks like if man doesn't eat of that. I will say C.S. Lewis has an imagination of it. In his space trilogy, he writes 2 books really, imagining what does it look like if man doesn't do this. And he contemplates all of that, and I think gives some pretty substantive explanations for what it might look like if God hadn't done that. But in fact, in Paralandra, if you want to go read the second book of that space trilogy, Satan. Satan character is tempting an Eve character, and it's on another planet. It's basically recreating the garden scene, and he's tempting. And one of the things he says is, God worked this into his plan, and look at all the good that came out of this, and the beauty. And I'm like, this sounds a little bit like Calvinism, right? that it's all part of the
Yes.
plan. Just eat the fruit, which it's not fruit in that case, but nevertheless. So I do think that when you take it back, it's sort of like talking with an atheist. You take it all the way back to the beginning, there's a problem. And I think the same thing with Calvinism. You take it all the way back to the beginning. At some point, you got to figure out how God's causing evil but isn't responsible for it. And I don't have that problem. I can make that degree of separation, but the Calvinist, again, can't make the degree of separation.
All right, so that gets me to a place I wanted to go. This is what Joel said about that quote in Bruce's usage of the Talbot quote. He said Bruce selected the particular quote that he's shown us for the emotional impact and the revulsion that he knew it would produce. Shawn, first. Shawn, do you think that's why Bruce brought up that quote, was to have an emotional impact and to produce a sense of revulsion amongst the audience?
No. Did it have an emotional impact? Did it likely produce a sense of revulsion among the audience? Yeah, because it's a revolting statement. But the reason it was brought up is as I said, when we started talking about this is a logical consequence of the position that Joel was taking on election and meticulous sovereignty. And it was worth bringing up for the audience to see if Joel could explain coherently how all these things could be true, how a good, holy, loving, just God could ultimately be the reason that we have, and of course Talbot goes to the Nazis, because why not? Everybody else does. Ultimately, the reason we have Hitler is because God decided to have Hitler, as Hitler was. And so, that has an emotional impact, but it's not rooted in emotionalism. It's rooted in logic and the consequences of the position.
Stephen?
Yeah. So I'll have a little bit different take on this. I think it is emotionally provocative, and purposefully so, right? And I don't mind that. And I think even Joel acknowledges that, like, that's legitimate within a debate, right? You're trying to expose someone. So what do? You take the most outlandish aspect and consequence of what they're saying, and you put that forward. You're trying to show people this is shocking. What this person believes is horrifying if you play it on out. Now, I will say to Joel's point that, like everything else, that anybody can find a Bible passage that is emotionally stirring that would put us in a bind. Now, I don't mean a bind we can't get out of. I don't mean a bind that we can't explain, but it would be emotionally charged, right? I mean, go find a passage about slavery, and here we go, or anything about marriage laws and really just the book of Leviticus, right? You just, what do you do with this? And then put you in the position of defending, and a lot of people get very defensive about that and are unwilling to defend God's law. But so I from the standpoint of what Joel's saying is, this is a good tactic, but it's a legitimate tactic, right? And so when somebody says to me, for instance, when they go to the book of Leviticus and say, do you believe this? Do you believe what God said about this is good and right and just? I say, yes, I do. I'll double down on it. I tell people, when they pull up a passage they think I'm going to be uncomfortable with, they go find a Bible passage and go, well, Stephen is going to affirm what this passage says. I say, I don't just affirm it. I want to put it to music and sing it. I am on board with every single verse of the Bible, and I'm not afraid of any of them. That's Joel's job now, is to own it, right? is to say,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I fully
Mhm.
accept the consequences of, and 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 the emotional repulsion, and to deal with that. I understand people are going to be emotionally repulsed by what the Bible says about homosexuality. I accept that. I accept that reality. And I know if I was debating a homosexual, that he would go to those passages, that he would show a passage that says they ought to be stoned, and expect me to flounder and capitulate when I try to explain what God is actually doing there, instead of standing by what God says. So yes, it's an emotionally charged statement. But the guy who said it, I think, was trying to be emotionally charging.
Mhm.
Right. I think on the other side, he was trying to steel people up for this reality that is a consequence of his position. And I think from the standpoint of Joel saying the context, I do think, like, I've read the book that he's talking
Mhm.
about, and several like it. And the
Mhm.
context is that, isn't it better? Isn't it more comforting when your suffering is in the hands of God? And it's a little bit like David after he's committed the sin of the numbering, and he chooses among the punishments the one that most fully puts him in God's hands. And so he'd rather suffer at God's hands than, random enemies. And I appreciate that. But I think, again, stretching that all the way out and universalizing that so that every suffering is a direct consequence of God's action is more than the Bible proclaims, and does leave you trying
Mm-hmm.
to defend morally and emotionally undefensible positions.
Yeah.
So then, the next the response that he gives after saying, "I affirm what Talbot says there," and then he presents this polar opposite perspective. Should we instead believe that God was unable or unwilling to stop the Nazis' brutality and the evil serial killer who was named in that quote? So let's just answer that real quick. Somebody comes to you, Shawn. I'll go to you first, and then to Stephen. Somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, you supposedly serve this loving God, but what about childhood cancer? What about those who survive abuse? Where's your good God in all of this?" Shawn, how would you respond?
Well, ultimately, he's going to rectify all of that. There will be justice. His mercy is going to be seen. Yes, there are evil, horrible, terrible things. Do I wish we could live in a world where that didn't exist? Sure. But as we mentioned before, if we're going to be able to have love for God, if we're going to be able to have love for one another, then there's going to have to be the potential for all that evil. And I guess ultimately what God is doing is saying it's worth it. And by the way, he doesn't just say that from heaven. He comes down here in the flesh and participates in it, right? He suffers. And so he doesn't just say it's worth it for you to suffer so that you can have free will, so that you can love me. He ultimately says it's worth it for me that you have free will, and I'm willing to suffer just like you so that I can participate in love with you. And so this isn't just some bully God deciding that, hey, if you're going to love me, here are the hoops you have to jump through. And instead, what we see is this idea, Marshall kept using the word participation when we talked to him. God's willing to participate in that suffering with us in order to engage in that relationship. Um, is that still difficult? Yeah, that there's still difficulties to be endured there. But I don't know what other option there is other than for us to be, moist robots, as some of our atheist friends would describe us.
Yeah, I think
Stephen, go ahead.
I'm a foster parent. We've adopted here in Limestone County, and you end up seeing a lot of that suffering. And I've talked with some of the other foster parents, and it's so frustrating to see some of the ways that the system handles that. But as we were discussing how it might be handled better just the other day, we immediately ran into other difficulties, right? So a lot of our frustration is sending kids back to houses they shouldn't be sent back to. But immediately, as we talked about some of the things they could do to avoid that, to mitigate that, we realized if we universalized that rule, they could start taking kids out of houses of perfectly good and right parents, and we don't want that. And so, in other words, to be a consistent and just system, there are going to be allowances that leave room for the suffering of children, not because anybody in the system wants children to suffer, but because if we were to take away the possibility for suffering, then what we would do is have to just remove parents entirely.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately, I think, the position that God's in. He's got a choice. He must leave room for this suffering or take it, and therefore the cause of all the suffering, which is all the humans in the world, ultimately away. So he leaves us room to, and you see this in Genesis 6, that ultimately when God says, okay, I'm going to remove all the problems, I got 8 people left, right? And then it's not long before those 8 people are causing
They're the problem.
right?
Yeah.
So these are the options, right? Leave room for suffering, or remove the project entirely. Take all the people away, and so I think that's a morally defensible explanation of what God is doing, and far more morally defensible. And I understand now. Look, what we're saying is God is allowing this in service of free will. What the Calvinist is saying is God is allowing this in service of some hidden good purpose. And I don't believe that the Bible ultimately leads us to the conclusion that every particular is God operating towards some greater purpose. In fact, I believe he accomplishes his good purposes often in spite of the things that people are doing, not in service or in participation of the things people are doing.
There's one other thing I wrote down. Is there anything else you guys want to say before we kind of put a bow on this? Is there anything else you want to say about evil in the context of this discussion, the Reeves-Ellis discussion, how it played out? Anything you want to add to that, Shawn, first?
Well, it's a very cheery subject we decided to discuss this morning at 10 o'clock. Yeah, I mean, and hopefully we've been able to represent this on some level. This is a subject that demands a lot of thinking. It may, in some cases, create more questions than answers. But we need to be willing to reason through these things. Ultimately, I think this comes down to a question of, does God reveal himself logically? Does God reveal himself in a way that's coherent? And to me, to get to that, and I agree with what you were just saying a minute ago there, Stephen, that some of these things are emotionally charged just by their nature. But at some point, I've got to be willing to kind of set that aside and say, okay, well, what has God actually said? And how can I accumulate those things and work through those things in a coherent way? And if God didn't reveal himself that way, then I don't know that God revealed himself, if that makes sense to you. And so where I fall on this is not just about, why I think bad things happen. It's ultimately, who is this God we're serving? And is he someone we can depend on and trust in?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would I would add that I think as far as, the discussion of evil, in the debate, this did not get fleshed out, as far as we might like it, but it was impossible to, right?
Oh, yeah.
As I said, this subject has filled volumes and volumes and volumes. And so, a few 20-minute speeches weren't ever going to ferret this out. And it's a little bit, it's not unnecessary, but it's a little bit of a tangent to the main subject that the debate was about. It interacts with it, intersects with it, but it wasn't the subject of the debate, obviously. And so ultimately, that those explanations weren't going to be satisfactory. And I'll just say, I can't. I'm never going to be able to give an explanation that will fully and completely satisfy someone whose little girl has just been brutally, abused, murdered, and to come in and give an explanation that's going to make them feel pleasant. That is an unpleasant thing. What I'm trying to do is, like Job, grapple with it in a way that leaves me content to continue to worship God and say, I know who my deliverer is. And I cannot reconcile that with the Calvinist view of God. That leaves me, I think often about the way skeptics argue against God, and most often they're arguing against the Calvin God.
Right.
Because he's a pretty easy God to pick on from the standpoint of this looks wicked. And so I think, if you go read the El Derir Hutto debate back in the 70s that was in Birmingham, Hiram Hutto debated a Muslim, and he thought Hiram believed in a Calvinist God. And that was one of those moments where he came prepared to debate somebody else. And I think that's what happens is when a skeptic describes the Calvinist God, I go, yeah, that's a pretty good point. It is kind of a moral monster, but I don't believe in that God, right? I believe in a God who leaves room and therefore is not responsible for what people do with that room that he's left them. Now, does that bring up some difficulties? And I'll say, here's the real difficulty. What does God know? When does he know it? When does he choose to know it? These are questions that I cannot fully wrap my head around. I am not a fully open theist, but I'm not a determinist. And I don't think God has scripted the whole thing out to meticulous detail, leaving no room for people to make choices. And so I believe God interacts with real viable people with viable choices, leaving room for distinct possibilities while still maintaining his omniscience and omnipotence, and that those don't destroy each other. But I'm not sure how those interact. I'm not sure what the mind of God is in those instances. And I think that is a place where I'm not trying to hold mutually exclusive things. I'm seeing I could give you several different potential explanations, but I'm not certain which one would be the correct, or even if any of them would be the correct way to describe it.
Yeah.
I think you're both right that this issue of the question of evil goes back to the nature and the character of God. And that is why it is important in the context of the discussion that happened, because when we're talking about election, we're talking about the nature and the character of God. Is this haphazard? Is this arbitrary? Is there a reason behind it? Why is God acting as he does? Is he a God of logic? Is logic rooted in the person and the nature and the character of God? Is love who God is? I think all of these things, it ultimately is a question of who God is, how he is presented in Scripture, and then what we do with that. And so thank you both for bringing us back to that focal point. Let's end on this. All three of us have made statements to this regard that, hey, this is a deep subject, the question of God and evil and how these two concepts can be reconciled. I want you each give me one book recommendation besides the Bible. Give me one book recommendation that has helped you think through the question of the existence of evil and the existence of God. Stephen, why don't you go first?
Whew. Okay. So I want to be very careful here.
You are not, in giving a recommendation for a book, you are not giving your stamp of approval to everything that the author says, every belief that the author holds. We're just looking for a book that helps us think in a biblical way about this.
None of that is true.
Focus subject.
None of that is true. You're absolutely stamping your approval on everything.
That's right. I'm going to get roasted. So I'm going to start with a quote. Tommy Peeler one time recommended a commentary, and he says, "This guy's a total heretic, but the last couple of chapters are golden." So, so Greg Boyd, I think, is a total heretic, but he's written a book called "God at War." I think describes, it pushes back on some of the traditional Reformed ways of looking at this in ways that I think are helpful. And it presents the picture that God is not working in harmony with the forces of evil, but that he is at war against them, that we live in a war zone, and that battle is real, and that enemies are making actual distinct libertarian decisions, and that God is fighting back against them. And that we are in a place of choosing which side we are on, and so forth. And so I think that is a much more wholesome and appropriate way to look at the realities we live in. Now, Greg Boyd is a wildly open theist, and he's a complete social liberal, and all sorts of other problems I have with Greg Boyd. But I think he helps in thinking about that reality that we live in.
Okay. Shawn, what about you?
I'm going to go with a classic, and I'm terrible at remembering titles, but C.S. Lewis, I think it's The Problem of Pain, where he really gets into evil and the reason for evil and the relationship with love, a lot of the things we've talked about here. I'm not saying that's got all the answers, but he sure explores some things in a very interesting way.
Yeah.
And very readable, too, to be as smart as that guy was.
Yeah, it's way more readable than God at War that I recommended. You should start there.
I'll split the difference here. I'll come in somewhere in the middle. I'm looking at one of my bookcases over here. You guys have both read this before, I know, but if someone in our audience is thinking about it, Paul Capan's book is God, a Moral Monster. While it's going to deal specifically, as Stephen mentioned, with some of those Old Testament questions and trying to sort through them, certainly he gives a way of thinking about God and the existence of evil and hardship in a way that might be productive and might challenge your thinking a little bit. So,
yeah.
Him and Shawn. I know, Shawn, you and I both enjoy listening to Frank Turek. Turek sometimes has some, like anyone, sometimes I think he's way off the mark. Sometimes he nails it. Stephen, I'll tell you the story. I went and heard Turek speak at the University of Dallas one time, and he gets there to Romans, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. And I hear him give the same explanation to that passage that you, me, and Shawn would give to that passage. And I was just absolutely just floored. I did not expect to hear that, but Turek's helpful on some of these matters as well. But Stephen, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We've taken enough of your time already, so we'll let you get out of here. But thank you so much for
a great, enjoyable discussion.
Appreciate it. We'll hope to have both you and Marshall back sometime. That was my first time to get to meet you in person. No, it wasn't. We met at Deason's Bible study. And we've interacted there, but this was the first time we got to spend a whole lot of time together. Really enjoyed that, getting to meet your family. But thank you, and thank you to the folks there at Pepper Road for treating us all so kindly.
Yeah, absolutely. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, Shawn, I'm gonna get off too. It's lunchtime. I'm getting hangry, and that's about it. So
that's about it. All right. Well, Stephen, but to all of and
Shawn's got a buddy.
That's right.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. We went a little bit longer than normal today, but this is a topic, as you realize, that deserves some time and attention. But thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with another episode. And until then, Shawn, have a good day, man.
All right, you too.
See you guys.